In the summer of 2013, a 36-year-old botanical researcher named Dr. Lauren Mitchell disappeared without a trace in the Sequoia National Forest near the Giant Forest Grove in California. For 5 years, her family searched. Investigators followed every possible lead, and volunteers combed through miles of ancient woodland, hoping to find even the smallest clue. But Lauren had vanished so completely that many began to believe she would never be found. Then in September of 2018, during a routine trail maintenance check in a remote section of the forest, 2 park workers stumbled upon something they would never forget. Sitting against the base of a massive sequoia tree, wearing a faded blue field shirt and looking impossibly thin, was a woman who barely seemed alive. Her eyes were half open, her breathing shallow, and her body so frail that at first glance she looked like she had been there for decades. It was Dr. Lauren Mitchell, and the story of how she survived 5 years alone in the California wilderness would soon become one of the most baffling and disturbing cases in the history of missing persons in the American West. Before we dive into today's vanished story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. On July 18, 2013, Dr. Lauren Mitchell left her home in Fresno at approximately 6:45 in the morning. Her neighbor, a retired teacher named Margaret Hollis, saw her loading equipment into her white Honda CR-V. Margaret later told investigators that Lauren seemed focused that morning, methodical in the way she packed her vehicle. She was wearing her usual field work clothes, a light blue long-sleeved shirt designed to protect against sun and insects, khaki hiking pants with multiple pockets, and well-worn trail boots that showed years of outdoor use. Lauren had told her research partner at California State University, a professor named Dr. James Brennan, that she was planning a 3-day solo research trip to document a rare subspecies of lupin that only grew in specific microclimates within the Sequoia National Forest. James later recalled that Lauren had been excited about this trip for weeks. She had spent months reviewing satellite imagery, studying topographic maps, and coordinating with the Forest Service to identify the exact locations where these plants might be thriving. This was not unusual for Lauren. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, someone who never went into the field unprepared. Dr. Mitchell was not new to wilderness research. She had earned her PhD in botany from UC Berkeley, spent 2 summers working in the Alaskan tundra, and had published over a dozen peer-reviewed papers on native California flora. Her friends described her as someone who was more comfortable in the forest than in a laboratory, who could identify hundreds of plant species by sight, and who understood the rhythms and dangers of working alone in remote environments. She carried the right gear, knew how to read weather patterns, and always filed detailed trip plans with the university's field research office. On that particular morning, according to the entrance logs at the Giant Forest Museum Ranger Station, Lauren signed in at 8:35. The ranger on duty that day, a man named Thomas Rivera, remembered her because she asked about recent trail conditions in the northern sections of the park. He told her that several trails had been affected by late-season snowmelt and that some of the more remote areas might still have muddy patches and fallen trees. Lauren thanked him, mentioned she was heading toward the remote Redwood Canyon area, and showed him her permit for off-trail botanical research. Thomas noted her vehicle information and estimated return date of July 21st in the logbook, then watched her drive toward the trailhead parking area. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. The trail Lauren intended to explore was not one of the popular tourist routes. Redwood Canyon is a lesser-known area of Sequoia National Forest, a place where the crowds thin out and the forest becomes dense and primeval. The terrain there is challenging. Steep ravines cut through thick groves of giant sequoias, sugar pines, and white firs. The undergrowth is heavy with manzanita, ferns, and fallen logs covered in thick moss. It is beautiful but disorienting, the kind of place where even experienced hikers can lose their bearings if they wander too far from marked trails. On the day Lauren disappeared, the weather was clear. The temperature in the lower elevations hovered around 78 degrees, and there were no storms forecasted. Conditions were ideal for field work. But by the evening of July 21st, when Lauren had not returned to Fresno and had not answered any of James Brennan's calls or emails, her research partner began to worry. James tried calling several more times throughout the evening. Each call went straight to voicemail, which was not entirely unusual in the mountains where cell service was spotty at best. But Lauren had always been reliable about checking in when she returned to an area with service, even if it was just a brief text message to confirm she was safe. By 10 o'clock that night, James contacted Lauren's emergency contact, her older sister who lived in Sacramento, a woman named Patricia Mitchell-Kearney. Patricia immediately tried calling Lauren's phone with the same result. She then called the Fresno Police Department, who advised her to wait until morning since Lauren's estimated return date had only just passed. But Patricia knew her sister's habits. Lauren was never late without explanation. She never missed check-ins. Something was wrong. The next morning, Patricia drove to the Sequoia National Forest Ranger Station and filed an official missing person report. By noon on July 22nd, a search and rescue operation had been launched. The initial response was swift and organized. Rangers began at the Redwood Canyon trailhead where Lauren's vehicle was found parked exactly where she had left it, locked and undisturbed. Her permit indicated she planned to work in a roughly 2-square-mile area north of the main trail, focusing on several locations she had marked on her research maps. Search teams were deployed immediately. They moved along the designated trails, calling her name, checking every side path and clearing. Tracking dogs were brought in to pick up her scent from clothing her sister provided. The dogs led searchers approximately 3 miles into the forest before losing the trail near a rocky creek bed. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the area, scanning the dense canopy for any signs of heat signature. Volunteers arrived in significant numbers, many of them fellow researchers, former students, and members of the botanical community who knew and respected Lauren's work. For the first 5 days, the operation was intensive. Teams worked from dawn until dusk, covering difficult terrain, checking ravines, inspecting natural shelters under fallen logs, and searching areas where someone injured or disoriented might seek refuge. They found nothing. No footprints beyond the initial trail, no pieces of equipment, no signs of a struggle or accident. It was as if Dr. Lauren Mitchell had simply walked into the forest and ceased to exist. One of the search coordinators, a veteran ranger named Ellen Vasquez, later said in an interview that the case troubled her from the beginning. She explained that Lauren's research site was not in particularly treacherous terrain. While remote, it was not the kind of area where someone would simply vanish. There were no cliffs where she might have fallen, no rivers strong enough to sweep someone away, and no areas known for dangerous wildlife encounters. Ellen said the forest felt quiet during those search days, almost unnaturally so, as if it were holding its breath. On the 8th day, the official search was scaled back. The incident commander explained to Patricia and other family members that they had covered an area far larger than Lauren could have traveled on foot, even if she had become lost and wandered. The tracking dogs had found no extended trail. The helicopters had detected nothing unusual. The conclusion, though never explicitly stated, was that Dr. Mitchell had either suffered an accident so sudden and complete that it left no trace, or something else entirely had happened. Patricia Mitchell-Kearney refused to accept that explanation. For weeks after the official search ended, she returned to the forest with volunteers, walking the same trails, studying Lauren's research notes, and speaking to anyone who had been in the area around the time of her sister's disappearance. She posted flyers at every ranger station, campground, and trailhead within 50 miles. Lauren's face looked out from those flyers, smiling in a photo taken during a field research trip, her eyes bright with the kind of contentment that came from doing work she loved. But no one called with information. As the months passed, the case grew cold. The missing person report remained open, but there were no new leads. Lauren's bank account showed no activity after July 18th. Her phone never reconnected to any network. Her research equipment, her notes, her carefully planned study, all of it seemed to have disappeared with her. By the end of 2013, the story had faded from local news outlets. A few articles were written on the 6-month anniversary of her disappearance, but they offered no answers, only the same questions. Where had Dr. Lauren Mitchell gone? How could a trained researcher, someone who knew the forest and understood wilderness safety, vanish so completely? Her family continued to hope, but hope became increasingly difficult to sustain. Patricia organized anniversary searches in 2014 and 2015, bringing in volunteers and private search teams who specialized in cold cases. They explored new areas, reviewed old evidence, and interviewed hikers who had been in Sequoia around the time Lauren disappeared. They found nothing of value. In 2016, the family hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Robert Simmons who had worked missing persons cases for over 2 decades. He spent 4 months reviewing every detail of the case, walking the trails Lauren would have walked, and analyzing her research documents for any clues about where she might have gone. His final report was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. He stated that, in his professional opinion, Dr. Mitchell had either been the victim of foul play by someone who knew how to cover their tracks, or had suffered an accident in a location so remote and well hidden that it might take years or even decades to discover her remains. The family was devastated, but they refused to give up completely. Then, in the late summer of 2018, something changed. On September 12th, 2 park maintenance workers named Daniel Cross and Amy Thornton were conducting routine trail work in a section of the forest approximately 6 miles northeast of the Redwood Canyon area. It was a part of the park that saw very little visitor traffic, mostly because there were no marked trails and the terrain was extremely difficult to navigate. The area was dense with undergrowth, filled with massive fallen sequoias that created natural barriers, and the ground was uneven, covered with centuries of decomposing organic matter that made every step uncertain. They were clearing debris from an old fire access road that had not been used in years when Amy noticed something unusual through the trees. At first, she thought it was just a pile of old fabric or camping gear that someone had abandoned, but as they moved closer, pushing through thick ferns and low-hanging branches, she realized it was a person. The figure was sitting upright with her back against the trunk of an enormous sequoia, one of the ancient giants that had stood in that spot for over 1,000 years. Her legs were stretched out in front of her, and her arms lay motionless at her sides. She was wearing what looked like the remains of a blue shirt, so faded and torn that it was barely recognizable as clothing. Her pants were in similar condition, shredded at the knees and caked with dirt. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks sunken so deeply that her cheekbones seemed to press against her skin. Her hair, which hung in matted strands around her shoulders, was streaked with gray despite the woman appearing to be middle-aged. Daniel called out, but there was no response. Amy moved closer, her heart pounding, and knelt down beside the woman. She checked for a pulse and found one, faint and irregular, but present. The woman's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Her eyes were half open, staring at nothing, and her lips were cracked and colorless. Amy immediately radioed for emergency medical assistance, her voice shaking as she described what they had found and provided their GPS coordinates. Daniel stayed with the woman, speaking softly, trying to get any kind of response. The woman did not move. She did not blink. She did not seem to register their presence in any meaningful way. It was only when Daniel gently touched her hand that her fingers twitched slightly, a small involuntary movement that suggested some level of awareness buried deep beneath the surface. The rescue team arrived within 35 minutes, rappelling down from a helicopter because the terrain was too rough and overgrown for ground vehicles to access quickly. Paramedics assessed her condition on site and found it to be critical. Her body temperature was below normal. Her heart rate was dangerously slow. She showed severe signs of malnutrition and dehydration. Her muscle mass had wasted away to almost nothing. Her hands were covered in calluses and old scars, and her feet, which were bare and filthy, were heavily damaged with thick, cracked skin and partially healed wounds. One of the paramedics, a woman named Lisa Chen, later said in her report that the woman looked like someone who had been living in absolute isolation for years. Her body showed signs of chronic stress and deprivation, the kind of deterioration that does not happen over weeks or even months, but over years of barely surviving. They wrapped her in thermal blankets, started in 4 to get fluids into her system, and carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. She was airlifted to Kauai Delta Medical Center in Visalia, the nearest hospital equipped to handle her condition. During the flight, she remained unresponsive. Her eyes stayed half open, unfocused, and her breathing continued in the same shallow rhythm. The medical team worked to stabilize her vital signs, but they had no idea who she was or how long she had been in the forest. It was not until she arrived at the emergency room and a nurse began documenting her physical characteristics that someone thought to check missing person databases. A physician's assistant named Marcus Chin noticed a distinctive scar on her left forearm, a thin line that looked like it had been there for many years, possibly from a childhood injury. He ran a search through California's missing persons registry, filtering for women between 30 and 45 years old who had disappeared in the Central California region. When he saw the photo of Dr. Lauren Mitchell, he felt his stomach drop. The facial structure, the approximate height, the scar on the forearm, it all matched. He immediately contacted the Tulare County Sheriff's Department and requested that they pull the full case file on Lauren Mitchell. Within 2 hours, investigators had compared dental records from Lauren's medical history with X-rays taken at the hospital. The match was confirmed. The woman they had found barely alive in the Sequoia National Forest was Dr. Lauren Mitchell. She had been missing for 5 years, 2 months, and 25 days. The news that Dr. Lauren Mitchell had been found alive spread quickly through the hospital, and within hours it reached her family. Patricia Mitchell Kearney received the call just after 3 in the afternoon while she was at work in Sacramento. The voice on the other end belonged to a detective from the Tulare County Sheriff's Department, a woman named Detective Sarah Reeves, who explained that a woman matching Lauren's description had been discovered in Sequoia National Forest and was now receiving emergency treatment at Kauai Delta Medical Center. Patricia barely heard the rest of the conversation. She grabbed her keys, called her husband, and drove straight to Visalia, making the 3-hour trip in just over 2 hours. When she arrived at the hospital, she was met by Detective Reeves and a hospital administrator who tried to prepare her for what she was about to see. They told her that Lauren was alive but in critical condition. They explained that her body had suffered extreme trauma from prolonged malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure. They warned her that Lauren was not responsive, that she showed no recognition of her surroundings, and that the extent of her cognitive function was still unknown. Patricia nodded, but the words felt distant and unreal. All she wanted was to see her sister. When she entered the intensive care unit and saw Lauren lying in the hospital bed, she barely recognized her. The vibrant, energetic woman who had dedicated her life to studying plants, who had always moved with purpose and spoke with passion about her research, was gone. In her place was someone who looked decades older, hollowed out, as if the forest had consumed everything vital and left only a shell. Lauren's face was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over prominent bones. Her arms were skeletal, the muscles wasted away to almost nothing. Her hair, once thick and dark brown, was now thin and streaked with premature gray. Patricia approached slowly, her legs trembling. She spoke her sister's name softly, then louder. Lauren did not respond. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at some point on the ceiling that only she could see. Patricia reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. For a moment, she thought she felt Lauren's fingers move, the slightest pressure in return. But the doctors monitoring the room could not confirm whether it was intentional or simply a reflex. Over the next several days, a team of medical specialists worked around the clock to stabilize Lauren's condition. Blood tests revealed severe deficiencies in multiple vitamins and minerals, particularly vitamin D, B12, and iron. Her body was in a state of advanced starvation, her metabolism having slowed dramatically to conserve what little energy remained. Her muscles had atrophied to a degree that suggested years of limited movement and inadequate protein intake. Bone density scans showed signs of stress fractures in her feet and lower legs, injuries that had healed improperly without medical intervention, likely the result of repeated trauma from walking on uneven ground. X-rays revealed other troubling details. Several of her ribs showed evidence of old fractures, hairline cracks that had mended on their own over time. Her teeth were in poor condition, with multiple cavities and significant enamel erosion, possibly from consuming acidic wild plants or from grinding her teeth during periods of extreme stress. One of the examining physicians, Dr. Marcus Brennan, noted in his report that Lauren's physical state was consistent with someone who had been living in survival mode for an extended period, subsisting on minimal nutrition and enduring conditions that would have been fatal for most people. But the most concerning aspect of Lauren's condition was not physical. It was psychological. She did not speak. She did not react to voices, to touch, or to any external stimuli in a way that suggested comprehension. Her eyes would occasionally move, tracking objects or people as they passed by, but there was no recognition in them, no emotion, no indication that she understood where she was or who was around her. A neurologist brought in to assess her cognitive function, Dr. Helen Okoye, conducted a series of tests and found that while Lauren's brain activity was present, it was significantly muted. Dr. Okoye described it in her notes as a form of profound dissociative state, a psychological withdrawal so complete that Lauren's mind appeared to have disconnected from reality as a protective mechanism. Meanwhile, Detective Sarah Reeves began the complex process of investigating what had happened to Dr. Lauren Mitchell during the 5 years she had been missing. The location where she had been found was approximately 6 miles from the area where her research had been focused, deep in a section of the forest that had not been part of the original search grid. The terrain there was exceptionally difficult, with dense vegetation, fallen trees creating natural obstacles, and minimal visibility due to the thick canopy overhead. It was the kind of place that even experienced hikers would avoid unless they had a specific reason to be there. Detective Reeves assembled a specialized team to return to the discovery site. The team included forensic specialists, a botanist familiar with the regional ecosystem, a geologist who understood the local terrain, and 2 experienced wilderness trackers who had worked on numerous missing persons cases throughout California. They arrived at the location on September 15th, 3 days after Lauren had been found, and established a base camp a short distance from the massive sequoia where she had been sitting. The goal was to document every detail of the area, to reconstruct Lauren's movements as best they could, and to determine whether there was any evidence of another person having been present during her years in the forest. The team worked methodically, dividing the area into sections and photographing everything before disturbing any potential evidence. They used metal detectors to search for buried objects, collected soil samples, examined the bark and roots of surrounding trees, and carefully documented the position of every stone, branch, and natural feature. What they discovered over the next week painted a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Approximately 40 feet from where Lauren had been found, hidden beneath a thick layer of pine needles and decomposing leaves, the team discovered the remains of a makeshift fire pit. The stones that formed the circle were not native to the immediate area. A geologist confirmed that they had been carried from a rocky outcropping at least a quarter-mile away, which meant someone had intentionally gathered them and arranged them for repeated use. The ash inside the pit was analyzed and found to contain traces of wood, bone fragments from small animals, and what appeared to be remnants of plant material, possibly roots or bark that had been cooked or burned. Carbon dating suggested the fire had been used regularly over a period of at least 3 to 4 years. Near the fire pit, the team found several flat stones arranged in a way that suggested they had been used as a cooking surface or food preparation area. About 30 feet to the east, partially concealed by a fallen log covered in thick moss, they discovered what appeared to be a crude shelter. It was barely large enough for one person, constructed from branches, bark, and dried ferns wedged into a natural depression between 2 large boulders. The interior was lined with layers of pine needles and moss, creating an insulated space that would have provided minimal protection from cold and rain. Forensic analysts found strands of hair inside the shelter that matched Lauren's DNA, confirming that she had used it at some point during her time in the forest. But they also found something else. Mixed among Lauren's hair were several strands that did not match. The hair was longer, darker, and preliminary DNA analysis suggested it belonged to another individual. Detective Reeves felt her pulse quicken as she read the preliminary report. If someone else had been there, if Lauren had not been alone, then the entire nature of the case shifted. This was no longer just a story of someone lost in the wilderness. It became a potential criminal investigation involving abduction, unlawful imprisonment, and possibly other crimes that would only become clear as they gathered more evidence. The team expanded their search radius, looking for any additional signs of human activity. About a quarter-mile to the north, they found a second site. This one was more established, more permanent in its construction. There was a larger fire pit, this one surrounded by carefully placed stones that created a more efficient cooking area. Nearby was evidence of what appeared to be a small garden plot. The soil had been deliberately cleared and turned, and several wild edible plants, including a species of wild onion and a type of edible fern, had been cultivated in neat rows. Dr. Rachel Sato, the botanist on the investigative team, examined the garden area with growing concern. She explained to Detective Reeves that this level of cultivation required knowledge, planning, and consistent maintenance. Wild plants do not grow in organized rows naturally. Someone had cleared the competing vegetation, loosened the soil, and tended these plants over multiple growing seasons. Dr. Sato estimated that the garden had been active for at least 3 years, possibly longer. She said that while it was theoretically possible that Lauren, with her botanical training, could have created this garden, it seemed unlikely given her physical condition when found. Someone in a state of advanced starvation and psychological distress would not have the energy or mental clarity to maintain a cultivation project of this complexity. Near the garden, the team made another disturbing discovery. Carved into the bark of several surrounding trees were marks, deep, deliberate cuts that formed patterns. Some of them were simple vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, the universal method of counting days. The team counted over 800 such marks across multiple trees. But there were other symbols as well, crude drawings that did not correspond to any known language or marking system. Circles with radiating lines, triangles stacked in pyramids, abstract shapes that seemed to have meaning only to the person who had carved them. One of the trackers, a man named Vincent Morales, suggested that these might be territorial markers, signs left by someone to indicate ownership or boundaries. He had seen similar markings in cases involving people who had lived off the grid for extended periods, individuals who had created their own systems of communication and meaning, disconnected from conventional society. If that was the case, it raised an urgent question. Who had made them and where were they now? The forensic team also discovered a cache hidden beneath a flat stone near the larger fire pit. Inside were several items that did not belong to Lauren. There was a hunting knife with a handmade wooden handle, its blade worn but carefully maintained. There was a coil of thin cord, possibly made from plant fibers, braided with surprising skill. And there was a small waterproof pouch, the kind used by hikers to protect important documents. Inside the pouch was a notebook. The notebook was carefully extracted and transported to the forensic lab in a protective case to prevent further deterioration. Specialists worked to separate the pages, many of which had stuck together from moisture exposure, and photographed each one under controlled lighting. What they found was a journal, written over the course of many years in handwriting that varied dramatically from entry to entry. Sometimes the writing was neat and controlled, almost elegant in its precision. Other times it was wild and erratic, words running together, letters formed with such force that the pen had torn through the paper in places. The entries were not dated in any conventional way. Instead, they were marked by references to natural events. First snow, spring melt, the year the fire came close, the summer of no rain. Reading through them, it became clear that the writer had been in the forest for many years, possibly a decade or more, long before Lauren had disappeared. And at some point, the journal entries began to reference another person. One entry read, "Found her near the creek. She was calling out, confused. Brought her to the safe place. She does not understand yet, but she will. Out there is chaos. Here is order." Another entry, written in shakier handwriting. "She tried to leave again. I stopped her at the ridge. She was crying, saying she wanted to go home. There is no home out there anymore. This is home. I have made it so. She must learn." The entries continued, page after page, documenting a relationship that was deeply disturbing. The writer referred to Lauren as she or the woman and spoke of her as if she were a project, something to be guided and controlled. There were references to bringing her food, to watching her from a distance, to preventing her from leaving the forest. But there were also moments of strange tenderness, passages where the writer described sitting near her while she slept, or speaking to her even though she did not respond, or expressing what seemed like genuine concern when she appeared weak or ill. One passage stood out to Detective Reeves. "She has stopped fighting. That is good. Fighting only brings suffering. Now she sits quietly in the morning light and watches the trees. I think she understands now. The world outside is broken. Here, in the silence, we are real. We are free. The handwriting in that entry was unusually calm, the letters perfectly formed, as if the writer had reached some kind of resolution or acceptance. Detective Reeves handed the notebook to a forensic psychologist named Dr. Thomas Merrick, who specialized in criminal behavior and psychological profiling. Dr. Merrick spent several days analyzing the entries, and his assessment was chilling. He concluded that the writer exhibited clear signs of severe delusional disorder, combined with obsessive-compulsive tendencies and a profound detachment from reality. The person who wrote this journal believed, genuinely and completely, that they were protecting Lauren. They saw themselves not as a captor but as a savior, someone rescuing her from a world they perceived as corrupt, dangerous, and false. Dr. Merrick explained that this type of mindset was often found in individuals who had experienced significant trauma or loss, who had withdrawn from society entirely and constructed their own moral framework that justified actions which, by any objective standard, were harmful and criminal. He also noted that the journal entries suggested the writer had been living in isolation for many years before encountering Lauren. The language used, the references to the forest as a place of purity and truth, indicated someone who had completely severed ties with conventional society and rebuilt their identity around their environment. Dr. Merrick speculated that this person may have suffered a psychological break years earlier, something that drove them into the wilderness and kept them there, and that encountering Lauren had given them a sense of purpose they had been lacking. Detective Reeves now faced a critical question. Who was this person and where were they now? She submitted the DNA samples recovered from the shelter to every available database, including national criminal records, military personnel files, and missing persons registries. There were no matches. Whoever had been living in that forest with Lauren had no official identity, at least not one that appeared in any government system. Reeves reached out to local authorities, park rangers, and longtime residents of communities surrounding Sequoia National Forest, asking if anyone had reported sightings of a hermit or recluse living in the remote areas of the park. Several people came forward with stories. A hunter claimed that in the mid-2000s, he had encountered a person living in a cave in the northern section of the forest, someone who had avoided contact and disappeared before he could investigate further. A retired forest ranger said there had been rumors for years about someone living deep in the backcountry, avoiding trails and leaving almost no trace. But none of these accounts could be verified, and none provided enough detail to identify the individual. The investigation had reached a frustrating impasse. Reeves had a journal, DNA evidence, and a series of campsites that told a disturbing story, but no suspect. She knew that the person who had held Lauren captive could still be out there, somewhere in the vast expanse of Sequoia National Forest, living as they always had, hidden and unreachable. Back at the hospital, Lauren's condition began to show subtle signs of improvement. Her body was responding to the intravenous nutrition and fluids. Her vital signs stabilized. Her heart rate became more regular, and the dangerous pallor of her skin began to give way to a healthier color. But her mental state remained largely unchanged. She lay in bed, eyes open but distant, her face expressionless, her body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. Dr. Helen Okoye continued her neurological assessments, sitting beside Lauren's bed each day, speaking to her in a calm, gentle voice. She did not ask questions or expect responses. Instead, she simply talked, describing the room, the sounds of the hospital, the weather outside, anything that might help Lauren begin to orient herself to the present. She explained where Lauren was, that she was safe, that her family was nearby and waiting to see her. Sometimes Dr. Okoye would read aloud from botanical journals, knowing that Lauren's professional passion might trigger some level of recognition or engagement. Patricia visited every day, often spending hours sitting beside her sister's bed. She brought small items from Lauren's life before the disappearance. A photo of the two of them from a family vacation, a book on California wildflowers that Lauren had co-authored, a small pot containing a succulent plant that Patricia thought might bring some comfort. She placed these objects where Lauren could see them, hoping that something, anything, might break through the wall that trauma had built around her sister's mind. One afternoon in late September, nearly 2 weeks after Lauren had been found, something shifted. A nurse named Kevin Park was in the room checking Lauren's when he noticed her hand move. It was subtle, just a slight curl of her fingers, but it was deliberate, not the random muscle twitches they had seen before. Kevin stopped what he was doing and watched carefully. Lauren's hand moved again, this time reaching toward the edge of the blanket. Her fingers gripped the fabric weakly, then released it. Kevin spoke softly, asking Lauren if she could hear him. There was no verbal response, but Lauren's eyes shifted. For the first time since she had been admitted, her gaze focused on something specific, on Kevin's face. It lasted only a few seconds before her eyes drifted away again, but it was unmistakable. She had been aware, if only for a moment, of another person's presence. Kevin immediately paged Dr. Okoye, who arrived within minutes. She approached Lauren carefully, maintaining the same gentle tone she always used. She asked Lauren if she knew where she was. No answer. She asked if Lauren could hear her. Still no answer. But when Dr. Okoye reached out and gently touched Lauren's hand, Lauren's fingers closed around hers, holding on for just a moment before letting go. It was progress, small but undeniable. Over the following days, these moments became more frequent. Lauren began to respond to touch more consistently. She would turn her head when someone entered the room. She would blink when a light was shined in her eyes, not just as a reflex but as if she were actively registering the sensation. Her breathing would change slightly when Patricia spoke to her, a subtle acceleration that suggested some part of her recognized her sister's voice. Then, in early October, Lauren spoke her first word. It happened without warning. Dr. Okoye was sitting beside her, reading aloud from a field guide to Sierra Nevada flora, describing the characteristics of a particular species of pine. Lauren's lips moved, forming a sound so quiet that Dr. Okoye almost missed it. She stopped reading and leaned closer. Lauren's mouth opened slightly, and the word came again, barely a whisper, cold. Dr. Okoye felt a chill run down her spine. She asked Lauren to repeat it, and after a long pause, Lauren did, slightly louder this time, cold. It was the first coherent word she had spoken in over 2 weeks of hospitalization, and likely the first word she had spoken in years. Dr. Okoye wrote it down immediately, noting the time and context. She asked Lauren if she was cold now, if she needed another blanket. Lauren did not answer. Her eyes drifted back to the ceiling, and she fell silent again. But the door had been opened. In the days that followed, Lauren began to speak more, though her words came in fragments, scattered and disconnected. She would say single words or short phrases, often repeating them several times as if testing their weight and meaning. Trees. Dark. Alone. Hungry. Each word was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone, as if she were reciting a list rather than communicating thoughts or feelings. Dr. Okoye recorded every word, looking for patterns, trying to piece together what Lauren was attempting to say. She noticed that many of the words related to sensory experiences, to elements of the natural environment, to physical sensations like cold, hunger, and pain. There were no references to people, no names, no mentions of family or friends or her life before the forest. It was as if Lauren's entire world had been reduced to the raw elements of survival. Detective Reeves was informed of Lauren's progress and requested permission to speak with her. Dr. Okoye was hesitant, warning that Lauren was still in an extremely fragile state and that pushing her too quickly could cause her to retreat further into herself. But Reeves argued that if Lauren had been the victim of a crime, if someone had held her in the forest against her will, they needed to gather information as soon as possible to have any chance of finding that person. Dr. Okoye agreed to allow a brief, carefully supervised conversation, but only under strict conditions. Reeves could speak to Lauren, but she had to keep her questions simple and non-threatening. If Lauren showed any signs of distress, the session would end immediately. Dr. Okoye would remain in the room throughout the entire interaction to monitor Lauren's responses. On a quiet morning in mid-October, Detective Reeves sat down in a chair beside Lauren's bed. Lauren was sitting up for the first time, propped against pillows, her thin frame barely filling the hospital gown. Her eyes were open, looking toward the window where autumn sunlight streamed through half-closed blinds. Reeves introduced herself slowly and clearly. She explained that she was trying to understand what had happened to Lauren in the forest. She said she wanted to help, that she wanted to make sure Lauren felt safe. She asked if Lauren remembered going on a research trip 5 years ago. Lauren did not respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the window. Reeves tried again, asking if Lauren remembered getting lost, if she remembered what had happened after she left the trail. Still nothing. Then Reeves asked a different question. Was there someone else with you in the forest? At that, Lauren's expression changed. Her jaw tightened. Her hands, which had been resting loosely on the blanket, suddenly gripped the fabric. Her breathing quickened, and for a moment it seemed like she might speak. But instead, she turned her head away sharply, closing her eyes. Dr. Okoye stepped forward immediately, signaling to Reeves that the session was over. Reeves nodded and stood, but before she left, she placed her business card on the table beside Lauren's bed. She told Lauren that if she ever felt ready to talk, if she ever wanted to tell her story, she could reach out at any time. Lauren did not acknowledge her. That night, one of the nurses found Lauren sitting up in bed, staring at the card Reeves had left behind. She had picked it up and was holding it in her trembling hands, her fingers tracing the edges over and over. The nurse asked if she was okay, and Lauren looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Then, for the first time, Lauren asked a question. How long? The nurse did not understand at first and asked Lauren to clarify. Lauren repeated the question, her voice stronger this time, more focused. How long was I gone? The nurse hesitated, unsure how to answer. She told Lauren gently that she had been missing for 5 years. Lauren's face did not change. She simply nodded, as if confirming something she already knew, and lay back down, still clutching the detective's card in her hand. The next morning, Dr. Okoye arrived to find Lauren sitting in a chair by the window, the first time she had moved from the bed on her own. Patricia was there, sitting across from her, tears streaming down her face. Lauren was looking at her sister, really looking at her, and though she had not said anything yet, Patricia felt that something fundamental had shifted. Her sister was coming back, at least partially. Dr. Okoye approached carefully and asked Lauren how she was feeling. Lauren turned to face her and spoke in a low, steady voice. I want to remember. Dr. Okoye sat down beside her and asked what she meant. Lauren's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. She said that there were pieces missing, gaps in her memory that she could not fill. She remembered being in the forest. She remembered the cold, the hunger, the overwhelming sense of being lost. But she could not remember how she got there, or why she had stayed, or what had kept her from finding her way back. Over the following weeks, Dr. Okoye began working with Lauren using a technique called guided recall, a therapeutic method designed to help trauma survivors access buried memories without overwhelming them. The process was slow and delicate. Dr. Okoye would ask Lauren to focus on specific sensory details, the smell of the pine trees, the sound of wind moving through branches, the feeling of damp earth beneath her feet, and slowly build outward from there, allowing memories to surface naturally rather than forcing them. Lauren's memories came back in fragments, disjointed pieces that did not always fit together in a linear way. But each session revealed a little more. She remembered the beginning clearly enough. She had been following her research plan, moving through the forest with her field notebook, documenting plant locations and taking soil samples. She remembered feeling confident, at ease in the environment. She had done this kind of work dozens of times before. She remembered stopping to photograph a cluster of lupins growing in a small clearing, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in a way that made the purple flowers seem almost luminous. She remembered kneeling down to get a better angle, adjusting her camera settings. And then she remembered hearing something, a sound that did not belong. Not an animal, something else. Footsteps, maybe, or branches breaking under weight. She remembered standing up, turning toward the sound, and seeing movement between the trees. A figure partially obscured by shadow. She called out, thinking it might be another hiker or a ranger. But the figure did not respond. It just stood there, watching. And then there was nothing. A blank space where her memory simply stopped. Dr. Okoye asked Lauren what she remembered next. Lauren closed her eyes, her breathing becoming shallow as she tried to access what came after that gap. She said the next thing she could recall was waking up in darkness. Her head was pounding, and she felt dizzy, disoriented. She was lying on the ground, surrounded by trees, but nothing looked familiar. She tried to stand, but her legs would not support her weight. She tried to call out, but her voice felt weak, swallowed by the immensity of the forest. She remembered crawling, using her hands to feel her way through the dark, touching rough bark and cold stones, trying to find something she recognized. But everything looked the same. She did not know which direction led back to the trail, which way was north or south. She just knew she was lost, and the fear that settled in her chest was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She remembered finding water eventually, a small stream trickling between rocks, and drinking until her stomach ached. She remembered being so hungry that she tried eating leaves, bark, anything she could find, even though some of it made her sick. She remembered the cold, especially at night, when she would curl up against a tree and shake so violently she thought her bones might crack. And she remembered the fear of being found. Dr. Okoye pressed gently on this point, asking Lauren what she meant. Lauren's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She said that at some point she started to feel like she was being watched. Not by animals, by someone. She would hear sounds in the night, footsteps circling her location. She would wake up and find that things had been moved, her makeshift shelter adjusted, or food left near where she was sleeping. Small game already cleaned. Roots that she had not gathered herself. At first, she thought she was losing her mind, that isolation was causing her to imagine things. But the evidence was undeniable. Someone was there. Someone was watching her. And the most terrifying part was that she never saw them clearly. Just shadows moving between trees, always at a distance, always just out of reach. Dr. Okoye asked if this person ever spoke to her. Lauren nodded slowly. She said they had spoken, but not in a normal way. The words came from the darkness, from places she could not see. The voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the things it said made no sense. It talked about the forest being the only real place, about how the world outside was broken and false. It said that Lauren was safe now, that she had been saved, though from what, Lauren could not understand. She said she tried to argue at first, tried to explain that she wanted to go home, that people were looking for her. But the voice would not listen. It would simply repeat the same things, variations on the same theme. The outside world is chaos. Here is peace. You are safe now. Stop fighting. Lauren said that over time something inside her changed. The constant fear, the hunger, the cold, it all wore her down until she did not have the energy to fight anymore. She stopped trying to find her way out. She stopped hoping for rescue. The forest became her entire world, and the voice in the darkness became the only constant thing in it. Dr. Okoye asked if Lauren ever saw the person's face. Lauren hesitated, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. She said she had, once, though the memory was hazy, like something viewed through fog. It was during what she thought might have been her second year in the forest, though she had lost all sense of time by then. She had been sitting by a small fire, one that she had not built herself but had found already burning when she woke one morning. The person had been sitting across from her, on the other side of the flames. The firelight had illuminated their features just enough for Lauren to see. A weathered face, neither young nor old, with eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. Long hair, tangled and streaked with gray. Clothing made from animal hides and patched fabric, so worn it was barely recognizable as clothing at all. Lauren said the person had been watching her with an expression that was difficult to describe. Not hostile, not kind. Just watching, as if she were a puzzle they were trying to solve. She remembered trying to speak, trying to ask who they were, but her voice had come out as barely a whisper. The person had not answered. They had just continued to stare, and then, when the fire began to die down, they had stood and walked away, disappearing into the darkness so completely it was as if they had never been there at all. Patricia, who had been listening quietly from across the room, asked her sister if this person had ever hurt her. Lauren looked at her hands, at the scars and calluses that covered them. She said that the harm was not physical, not in the way people usually think of it. The person never struck her, never touched her violently. But they controlled everything. When she ate, what she ate, where she went. If she tried to leave, to walk in a direction that might lead to a trail or a road, she would find herself turned around somehow, ending up back where she started. She did not know if it was the person actively preventing her or if her own mind had become so fractured that she could no longer navigate properly. She said the worst part was not the isolation itself. It was the dependency. She relied on the person for survival, for food when she could not find any, for fire when she was too weak to make one herself. And that dependency created a kind of psychological bond, a connection that made her hate herself even as she felt grateful for each small thing they provided. It was a trap she could not escape, even when the physical barriers were not there. Dr. Okoye took extensive notes during these sessions, documenting Lauren's testimony with meticulous care. She knew that this information was crucial not only for Lauren's healing but also for the ongoing investigation. Detective Reeves had requested regular updates, and Dr. Okoye provided them, always careful to protect Lauren's privacy and emotional well-being while sharing details that might help identify the person responsible. Detective Reeves, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. Despite the journal, the DNA evidence, and Lauren's detailed descriptions, there was still no name, no confirmed identity, no clear trail to follow. The DNA recovered from the shelter had been run through every available database, including expanded searches through genealogical services and missing persons files going back 3 decades. There were no matches. The handwriting in the journal had been analyzed by experts, but it did not match any samples in forensic databases. Linguistic analysis suggested the writer had at least a high school education, possibly some college, based on vocabulary and sentence structure. But that information was too broad to be useful for identification purposes. Reeves decided to take a different approach. She began reaching out to experts in cases involving long-term isolation and wilderness survival, hoping to find patterns or similarities that might shed light on Lauren's situation. One of the people she contacted was a psychiatrist named Dr. Alan Porter, who had spent years studying the psychological effects of prolonged solitude on people who had lived off the grid for extended periods. Dr. Porter reviewed the case file carefully, read excerpts from the journal, and listened to recordings of Lauren's therapy sessions with Dr. Okoye. His analysis provided new insights that were both helpful and deeply unsettling. He explained that the person who had held Lauren exhibited characteristics of what he called a delusional protector, someone who genuinely believed they were acting in the victim's best interest even as they inflicted profound psychological harm. This type of individual, Dr. Porter said, often had a deeply distorted view of society and human relationships. They saw the modern world as corrupt, dangerous, and fundamentally broken, and believed that by isolating someone from it, they were saving them. The relationship, twisted as it was, became a form of codependency, with the captor deriving meaning and purpose from their role as guardian, and the victim, over time, losing the will or psychological capacity to resist. Dr. Porter also noted that the journal entries suggested the person had been living in complete isolation for many years before encountering Lauren, possibly a decade or more. The language used, the references to the forest as a place of truth and purity, indicated someone who had undergone a complete psychological transformation, rebuilding their entire identity around their environment and severing all connections to conventional society. What made Lauren's case particularly unusual, Dr. Porter explained, was the length of time she had survived. Most victims in similar situations either escaped within the first few months or did not survive at all. The fact that Lauren had endured for 5 years suggested that her captor had, in their own disturbed way, kept her alive, providing just enough food and assistance to prevent her from dying while simultaneously ensuring she remained too weak and psychologically fractured to escape effectively. Detective Reeves asked Dr. Porter if he thought the person was still in the forest. Dr. Porter said it was highly likely. People who withdraw from society to that degree rarely reintegrate. The forest had become their entire reality, and leaving it would feel like a kind of death. He suggested that the individual might still be out there, following the same patterns, living in the same remote areas, possibly even searching for Lauren, unaware that she had been found. The thought made Reeves's stomach turn. She immediately contacted Sequoia National Forest rangers and requested increased patrols in the area where Lauren had been discovered. She also arranged for additional trail cameras to be installed at strategic points throughout the forest, hoping to capture images of anyone moving through the remote sections of the park. Weeks passed with minimal results. The cameras recorded the usual wildlife: deer, black bears, coyotes, and the occasional hiker passing through on established trails. But there were no signs of the person they were looking for. Reeves began to suspect that the individual had somehow sensed the heightened activity and had gone even deeper into the wilderness, beyond the reach of patrols and surveillance. Back at the hospital, Lauren's recovery continued, though it was far from linear. There were good days when she seemed strong, when she could speak clearly and engage with her family and doctors. But there were also difficult days when the trauma resurfaced, when she would become silent and withdrawn, her eyes filling with a fear that no amount of reassurance could diminish. Her father, who lived in San Diego and had driven up as soon as he heard Lauren had been found, struggled to understand what his daughter had endured. He spent hours talking with Dr. Okoye, trying to comprehend the psychological impact of 5 years of captivity and isolation. Dr. Okoye explained that Lauren's mind had adapted to an environment of constant uncertainty and control, and that returning to normal life was not simply a matter of leaving the forest behind. The effects of trauma would stay with Lauren for years, possibly for the rest of her life. He asked if Lauren would ever be able to live independently again, to return to her research to experience joy. Dr. Okoye chose her words carefully. She said that recovery was possible, but it would require time, extensive therapy, and a strong support system. Lauren had survived something that most people could not even imagine, and that resilience, Dr. Okoye believed, would serve her well in the difficult road ahead. In late November, nearly 3 months after Lauren had been found, Dr. Okoye conducted a session that would prove to be a turning point. She asked Lauren to talk about the moments when she had tried to escape, when she had attempted to find her way back to civilization. Lauren was quiet for a long time before answering. She said there had been many attempts, especially in the beginning. She would wait until she thought the person was not watching, and then she would run, moving as quickly as her weakened body would allow. She would follow what looked like game trails, thinking they might lead to water sources or clearings. But every time, she would end up lost, more disoriented than before. The forest felt like a maze, endless and unchanging. There was one attempt she remembered more clearly than the others. It had been during what she thought was her 3rd year, though she could not be certain. She had found what looked like an old fire road, a path that had been cleared at some point, probably decades ago, and was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. She had followed it for hours, hope building with each step, convinced that it would lead to a ranger station or a highway. But as the sun began to set, she realized the road was looping back on itself. She had been walking in a circle. When she finally stopped, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, she looked up and saw the person standing in the path ahead of her. They did not say anything at first. They just stood there, silent and still, as if they had been waiting for her all along. Then they spoke, and Lauren said the words had stayed with her ever since. "There is no way out. The forest is a circle, and you are at its center. The sooner you accept this, the sooner you will find peace." Lauren said that was the moment something inside her broke completely. She stopped believing she would ever leave. She stopped looking for trails or roads or any sign of the outside world. She simply existed day after day, in a space that had shrunk to the size of a few trees and a patch of dirt. Dr. Okoye asked Lauren if she believed that statement now, if she still felt like the forest had no exit. Lauren looked at her with tired eyes and said no. She knew now that it had been a lie, a psychological trap designed to keep her compliant. But at the time, in that moment, it had felt like absolute truth. As Lauren's strength continued to improve, both physically and mentally, Detective Reeves requested another opportunity to speak with her. This time, Lauren agreed. Dr. Okoye arranged for the meeting to take place in a quiet room at the hospital, away from the bustle of the ICU, with Dr. Okoye present to monitor Lauren's responses and intervene if necessary. Detective Reeves entered the room and sat down across from Lauren, maintaining a respectful distance. She thanked Lauren for agreeing to talk and assured her that she could stop at any time if it became too difficult. Lauren nodded but said nothing. Reeves began by explaining what the investigation had uncovered so far. She described the campsites, the journal, the evidence of long-term habitation. She told Lauren that they believed the person who had held her was still in the forest, and that without more information, they had no way of identifying or locating them. Lauren listened without interruption, her face expressionless. When Reeves finished, she asked Lauren directly, "Can you tell me anything about this person that might help us find them? Anything at all?" Lauren was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "They never told me their name. I asked once early on, but they just looked at me like the question did not make sense. After that, I stopped asking." Reeves nodded and tried a different approach. "Can you describe them? Height, build, any distinguishing features?" Lauren closed her eyes, as if trying to pull the image from memory. "Tall, taller than me. Thin but not weak. Strong, in the way someone becomes when they live like that for a long time. Long hair, dark but graying. They wore clothes made from animal skins, patched together with fabric they must have scavenged. Their face." Lauren paused, struggling to find the words. Their face looked older than their body, weathered, but their eyes were sharp. They saw everything. Reeves took notes carefully. "Did they ever mention where they came from? Anything about their past?" Lauren shook her head. "No. They only talked about the forest, about how it was the only real place. Everything else was—" She trailed off, then continued, "They called it the false world. They said they had escaped it, and that I had too, even if I did not understand yet." "Did they ever hurt you?" Reeves asked, echoing Patricia's earlier question but in a more official capacity. Lauren's hands tightened in her lap. "Not physically. Not in the way you mean. But they took 5 years of my life. They took my ability to leave, to choose, to exist as myself. That is a kind of harm that does not leave visible scars." Reeves felt the weight of those words. She asked one more question, the one that had been bothering her since she first read the journal. "Why do you think they kept you alive? Why go through the effort of bringing you food, maintaining the campsites, keeping you from leaving but not letting you die?" Lauren looked directly at Reeves for the first time since the conversation had started. "Because I think they were lonely. I think they had been alone for so long that when they found me, they saw an opportunity. Not for companionship exactly, but for purpose. I became their project, their proof that their way of life was right. As long as I stayed alive, it validated their choice to leave the world behind." The answer sent a chill through Reeves. It made sense in a terrible way, and it aligned with everything Dr. Porter and Dr. Merrick had said about the psychology of long-term isolationists. But it also meant that this person was unlikely to stop. If Lauren had represented purpose and validation, they would need to find that again, potentially with someone else. Reeves thanked Lauren for her time and left the room feeling more determined than ever to find the individual responsible. But she also felt the weight of a difficult truth. They were searching for someone who did not want to be found, who had spent years, possibly decades, perfecting the art of invisibility in one of the largest wilderness areas in the United States. If you're finding Lauren's story as compelling as we are, please consider subscribing to stay updated on cases that challenge everything we think we know about survival and the human mind. In early December of 2018, nearly 3 months after she had been found, Lauren was deemed stable enough to be discharged from the hospital. The transition was carefully planned. She would move into her sister Patricia's home in Sacramento, where a room had been prepared specifically for her, quiet, filled with natural light, and decorated with plants that Patricia hoped might bring some measure of comfort. The doctors warned the family that the adjustment would be difficult. Lauren had spent 5 years in an environment of extreme isolation and control. Returning to the noise, complexity, and social expectations of normal life would be overwhelming. They were right. The first few weeks were extraordinarily hard. Lauren found the walls of the house confining, the presence of other people exhausting. She would wake in the middle of the night, disoriented and afraid, unsure of where she was. Patricia would find her sitting by the window, staring out at the trees in the backyard, her expression distant and unreadable. Sometimes Lauren would go outside and sit on the ground beneath an oak tree, staying there for hours regardless of the weather, as if she needed to feel the earth beneath her to convince herself she was real. Dr. Okoye continued to see Lauren twice a week, conducting sessions at Patricia's house rather than requiring Lauren to travel. They worked on grounding techniques, methods for Lauren to anchor herself in the present when memories of the forest became too vivid. They practiced making small decisions: what to eat for breakfast, what to wear, where to sit, choices that most people took for granted but that represented a reclaiming of autonomy for Lauren. Patricia did everything she could to create a safe, supportive environment. She worked from home most days so Lauren would not be alone. She cooked meals that were nutritious but not overwhelming, knowing that Lauren's digestive system was still adjusting after years of irregular nutrition. She gave Lauren space when she needed it and company when she seemed ready for it. Most importantly, she never pushed, never demanded explanations or progress, never made Lauren feel like she was failing if she had a difficult day. Lauren's father visited frequently, driving up from San Diego whenever he could. He would sit with his daughter in comfortable silence, or they would take short walks around the neighborhood, staying close to the house at first, then gradually venturing farther. He never asked about the forest unless Lauren brought it up, and he never expressed anger or grief in her presence, though Patricia could see the toll it was taking on him every time he had to leave. Detective Reeves stayed in contact throughout this period, providing updates on the investigation, even though there was little progress to report. The trail cameras remained in place, but weeks passed without capturing anything significant. The DNA analysis had been sent to additional labs, including private forensic services that specialized in genealogical matching, but no new information emerged. The person who had held Lauren captive remained a ghost, defined only by the evidence they had left behind and Lauren's fragmented memories. Then, in late January of 2019, something happened that reignited the investigation. One of the trail cameras, positioned about 2 miles from where Lauren had been found, captured an image that made Detective Reeves's pulse quicken. The timestamp read 3:27 in the morning. The photograph showed a figure moving through the trees, partially obscured by shadows and the low light of pre-dawn. The person was tall and lean, carrying what appeared to be a pack or bundle of some kind. They moved with a fluidity that suggested deep familiarity with the terrain, stepping over fallen logs and around dense undergrowth without hesitation. The image was grainy, the face not clearly visible, but the posture, the way the person carried themselves, the homemade clothing that looked like it was constructed from animal hides and salvaged fabric, all of it matched the description Lauren had provided. Reeves immediately assembled a search team and returned to the area where the camera had been placed. They arrived at first light and began a systematic search of the surrounding forest. The team included experienced trackers, forensic specialists, and several rangers who knew the area intimately. They moved carefully, looking for fresh tracks, disturbed vegetation, or any other signs that someone had recently passed through. What they found was both encouraging and frustrating. There were tracks, faint impressions in the soft earth near a creek bed, but they led into rocky terrain where they became impossible to follow. There were signs that someone had been foraging, plants that had been harvested, bark that had been stripped from certain trees, but no way to determine how recent the activity was. The team spent 3 days combing the area, expanding their search radius and checking locations where someone living off the grid might establish temporary camps. They found a few old fire pits, some scattered bones from small game, and one site where someone had clearly slept recently, the ground cleared and covered with pine needles, the vegetation around it disturbed in a way that suggested repeated use. But whoever had been there was gone, and they left no clear trail to follow. Reeves sent the trail camera image to Lauren, asking if it triggered any recognition. Lauren studied the photograph for a long time, her hands trembling slightly as she held the printout. She told Reeves that she could not be certain, that the image was too unclear, but there was something about the way the person moved, the silhouette, the posture, that felt familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. She said that if it was the same person, she hoped they stayed deep in the forest, far away from anyone else who might cross their path. Reeves asked Lauren if she wanted the search to continue, if she wanted the investigation to keep pursuing this person even if it took years with no guarantee of success. Lauren thought about it for a long time before answering. She said yes, not because she needed revenge or even justice in the traditional sense, but because she believed the person was dangerous. She believed that if they encountered someone else, someone who was not as lucky or as resilient as she had been, the outcome could be far worse. She said she had survived through a combination of her botanical knowledge, stubbornness, and circumstances that could not be replicated, and she did not want anyone else to endure what she had endured. Reeves promised Lauren that she would not give up. She arranged for the trail cameras to remain in place indefinitely and coordinated with park rangers to maintain heightened awareness in the remote sections of Sequoia National Forest. She also reached out to national parks and wilderness areas throughout California and neighboring states, sharing the case details and asking rangers to report any signs of someone living long-term in extreme isolation. As winter turned to spring in 2019, Lauren continued her slow, uneven journey towards something that resembled recovery. Her physical health had improved significantly. She had regained most of her weight, her muscle tone was returning, and the medical complications from prolonged malnutrition had largely resolved. But the psychological scars remained, surfacing in unexpected moments. A certain smell, the sound of wind through trees, the feeling of being alone in a room. Any of these could trigger memories that sent her spiraling back to the forest. Dr. Okoye continued to work with Lauren, and as the months passed, their sessions evolved from crisis management to long-term healing. They talked about identity, about who Lauren had been before the forest and who she was becoming after it. They talked about guilt, the irrational but persistent feeling Lauren had that she should have fought harder, should have found a way to escape sooner. Dr. Okoye helped Lauren understand that survival itself had been an act of extraordinary resistance, that simply staying alive in those conditions required a strength that most people would never have to access. Lauren also began to reconnect with parts of her old life, though cautiously. Her research partner, Dr. James Brennan, visited several times, bringing botanical journals and updates on developments in their field. At first, Lauren could barely look at the materials. The sight of plant taxonomy charts and field research protocols reminded her too much of the work she had been doing when everything fell apart. But gradually, with James's patient encouragement, she began to engage with the material again, reading articles, discussing theories, remembering why she had loved this work in the first place. One afternoon in early May, Lauren made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She told Patricia and Dr. Okoye that she wanted to return to Sequoia National Forest. Not to the place where she had been held, but to the area where her journey had begun, to the trails she had walked before everything changed. She said she needed to face it, to walk those paths again and prove to herself that the forest did not own her anymore. Dr. Okoye was cautious about the idea, warning Lauren that revisiting the site of trauma could be destabilizing, that it might trigger responses that would set back her progress. But she also understood the symbolic importance of what Lauren was proposing. After extensive discussion, they agreed that Lauren could make the trip, but only with proper support. Patricia would accompany her, along with Dr. Okoye and a park ranger who knew the area well. They would move slowly, and if at any point Lauren felt overwhelmed, they would turn back immediately. On a clear morning in late May, Lauren stood at the trailhead near the Giant Forest Museum for the first time in nearly 6 years. The parking area looked exactly as she remembered it, the same information boards, the same view of towering sequoias stretching into the distance. Her heart was pounding, and her hands were shaking, but she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Patricia walked beside her, a steady presence. Dr. Okoye stayed a few steps behind, watching Lauren carefully for any signs of distress. The ranger, a woman in her 30s named Maria Castillo, led the way, pointing out landmarks and explaining how the trail had changed over the years, small erosions here, new growth there, the forest constantly evolving. They moved slowly, taking frequent breaks. Lauren focused on the physical sensations of walking, the crunch of gravel under her boots, the warmth of sunlight filtering through the canopy, the rhythm of her breathing. For the first mile, she felt detached, as if she were watching herself from a distance. But as they climbed higher and the forest grew denser around them, something shifted. The fear she had expected, the panic she had prepared for, did not come. Instead, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, not the suffocating familiarity of captivity, but something older, something that reached back to who she had been before everything happened. She remembered why she had loved this place, why she had dedicated her career to studying its ecosystems. The forest was beautiful. The trees still reached toward the sky. The air still smelled of pine resin and earth. And for the first time in years, Lauren felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Peace. They reached a clearing about 2 miles in, a spot where the trail opened up to reveal a sweeping view of the valley below. Lauren asked to stop. She sat on a flat boulder, the same kind of rock she had probably sat on during her original research trip, and looked out at the landscape. Patricia sat beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Finally, Lauren said something that made Patricia's eyes fill with tears. She said that she had spent so much time being afraid of this place, hating it for what it represented, that she had forgotten it was also a place of extraordinary beauty. She said that the person who had taken her had tried to turn the forest into a prison, had tried to make it synonymous with suffering and control, but they had not succeeded. The forest was not evil. It was not her enemy. It was just a forest, vast and indifferent, and she had as much right to be here as anyone. Patricia reached over and took her sister's hand, and they sat together in the sunlight, listening to the wind move through the branches. When they finally stood to head back, Lauren turned and looked toward the deeper sections of the forest, the remote areas where she had been held. She knew she would never walk those trails again, that some boundaries were meant to remain in place. But she also knew that she had faced this place on her own terms, and that was enough. As 2019 progressed into 2020, Lauren continued to rebuild her life piece by piece. She moved into her own apartment in Sacramento, a small space with large windows and a balcony where she kept dozens of potted plants. She enrolled in an online course to refresh her botanical research skills, working at her own pace, taking breaks when she needed them. She even began accepting small freelance consulting projects, reviewing environmental impact studies and providing expert opinions on native plant preservation. The process was slow and nonlinear. There were still difficult days, mornings when she could not get out of bed, nights when the memories were too vivid to sleep through. But there were also good days, days when she felt like herself again, when she could think about the future without fear. She started hiking again, always with others and never in Sequoia, choosing trails that were well-traveled and open, places where she could enjoy nature without the weight of trauma pressing down on her. Detective Reeves continued her investigation, though it had become increasingly clear that finding the person responsible would require either extraordinary luck or a mistake on their part. The trail cameras remained active, and every few months they would capture something potentially significant, a figure in the distance, fresh tracks, evidence of recent activity. Each time, Reeves would assemble a team and search the area, and each time they would find traces but no person. In the fall of 2020, Reeves made a decision to expand the scope of the investigation. She reached out to a true crime podcast that specialized in unsolved cases, asking if they would be interested in covering Lauren's story. The goal was not sensationalism but exposure. She hoped that by reaching a wider audience, someone might come forward with information, a hiker who had encountered someone matching the description, a local resident who had noticed unusual activity, anything that might provide a new lead. Lauren was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of her story being shared publicly. But after discussing it with Dr. Okoye and Patricia, she agreed, with the condition that she would have control over how her experience was presented. The podcast episode was carefully produced, focusing on the investigation and the search for the unidentified individual rather than sensationalizing Lauren's suffering. It aired in December of 2020 and reached hundreds of thousands of listeners. The response was overwhelming. Tips flooded in from across the country. Most were well-meaning but not useful, people reporting hermits or recluses in their local areas who had no connection to the case. But a few stood out. A retired park ranger from Kings Canyon National Park, which borders Sequoia, called to say that in the early 2000s, he had encountered someone living in a remote cave system in the backcountry. He described the person as extremely withdrawn, avoiding all contact, and exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress. When he had tried to approach, the person had fled deeper into the caves, and despite several attempts to locate them again, they were never found. Another call came from a woman who had been hiking in Sequoia in 2017, about a year before Lauren was discovered. She said she had seen someone watching her from a distance, standing motionless among the trees. When she called out, the person vanished so quickly and completely that she had convinced herself she had imagined it. But after hearing the podcast and seeing the trail camera image that was shared with the public, she felt certain it had been real. These accounts, while not definitive, helped establish a pattern. It seemed likely that the individual had been living in the Sequoia and Kings Canyon wilderness for many years, possibly decades, moving between remote areas and avoiding contact with anyone who entered their territory. It also suggested that encountering Lauren had been an anomaly, a moment when their isolation intersected with someone else's path in a way that altered both their lives irrevocably. Detective Reeves compiled all of this information into an updated case file and shared it with federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. The case was classified as an ongoing investigation into unlawful imprisonment and potential kidnapping, with the suspect considered at large and potentially dangerous. By 2021, Lauren had reached a place in her recovery that felt, if not complete, then sustainable. She had learned to live with the trauma, to carry it without being consumed by it. She had returned to botanical research in a limited capacity, accepting a part-time position with a conservation nonprofit that allowed her to work remotely and set her own schedule. The work gave her purpose without overwhelming her, and she found satisfaction in contributing to environmental preservation efforts. She also began volunteering with a support organization for survivors of abduction and long-term captivity. Her role was limited at first, just answering emails and offering encouragement to others who were navigating their own recoveries. But over time, she became more involved, participating in peer support groups and occasionally sharing her story in carefully moderated settings. It was painful to revisit her experiences, but it was also empowering. She was no longer just a victim or even just a survivor. She was someone who had endured something unimaginable and was using that experience to help others. In the spring of 2022, Lauren made a decision that marked a significant milestone in her healing. She decided to write about her experience, not a full memoir, but a short essay focusing on the psychological aspects of survival and the process of reclaiming identity after trauma. She worked on it for months, collaborating with Dr. Okoye to ensure that it was honest but also respectful of her own boundaries. The essay was published in a psychology journal and later reprinted in several magazines focused on outdoor recreation and wilderness safety. The response was profound. Lauren received letters from people all over the world, survivors of different kinds of trauma, families of missing persons, researchers studying resilience and post-traumatic growth. People thanked her for putting into words something they had not been able to articulate, for showing that recovery was possible even when it felt impossible. Lauren read every letter, and she responded to as many as she could, finding meaning in the connection. Detective Reeves retired from the Tulare County Sheriff's Department in the summer of 2022, but before she left, she ensured that Lauren's case was handed over to a younger detective, a woman named Detective Amy Torres, who promised to keep it active. The trail cameras remained in place, the evidence remained cataloged and accessible, and the case file was reviewed regularly for any new developments. Torres proved to be as dedicated as Reeves had been. In 2023, she organized a specialized search operation using advanced thermal imaging drones and ground-penetrating radar to survey areas of Sequoia National Forest that had never been thoroughly investigated. The operation lasted 2 weeks and covered hundreds of square miles. They found several abandoned campsites, evidence of long-term habitation in a few locations, and one site that appeared to have been used recently, within the past 6 months based on the condition of the fire pit and the freshness of carved marks on nearby trees. But once again, the person themselves remained elusive. It was as if they could sense when people were looking for them, as if they had developed an almost supernatural ability to vanish into the landscape. Detective Torres came to the same conclusion that Reeves had reached years earlier. They were searching for someone who did not want to be found, someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility. Lauren accepted this reality with a calmness that surprised even herself. She told Detective Torres that while she appreciated the ongoing efforts, she had made peace with the possibility that the person might never be caught. She said that her healing could not be contingent on their capture, that she had to find closure within herself rather than waiting for external justice. Torres understood, but she also told Lauren that the case would remain open, that as long as there was even a small chance of finding the individual, they would continue searching. In 2024, Lauren marked what she considered a personal milestone. It had been nearly 6 years since she had been found, and in many ways, she felt like she had finally stepped out of the shadow of those 5 lost years. She had her own life again, small and carefully constructed, but hers. She lived independently, worked in a field she loved, maintained relationships with family and friends, and even began dating cautiously, finding someone who respected her boundaries and did not pressure her to share more than she was ready to. One afternoon in the fall of that year, Lauren returned to Sequoia National Forest one final time. She went alone, though she had told Patricia where she was going and had agreed to check in every hour. She drove to the trailhead where her journey had begun over a decade ago and sat in her car for a long time, gathering her courage. Then she got out and walked. She did not go far, just a mile or so along the main trail, enough to feel the forest around her, to breathe the air and hear the sounds of birds and wind and distant water. She found a quiet spot off the trail, a small clearing surrounded by towering sequoias, and she sat down on the ground. She thought about the person who had taken those years from her, wondered where they were now, if they were still out there living in their isolated world, if they ever thought about her. She realized, sitting there in the dappled sunlight, that she did not hate them. Hatred was too heavy, too consuming, and she had already carried enough weight. She did not forgive them either. Forgiveness was not something she owed to anyone, but she had let go of the need for their capture to define her healing. She had survived. She had rebuilt. She had found a way to move forward, and that, more than any verdict or arrest, was her victory. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Lauren stood and brushed the pine needles from her clothes. She looked around one last time at the towering trees, the ancient sentinels that had stood in this place for hundreds of years and would stand for hundreds more. The forest was not her enemy. It never had been. It was just a forest, indifferent and eternal, and she was just one person who had walked through it and emerged on the other side. She returned to her car and drove back to Sacramento, back to her small apartment with its plants and sunlight, back to the life she had built from the pieces of who she used to be and who she had become. And for the first time in a very long time, Lauren Mitchell felt something close to whole. As of 2025, the case of Dr. Lauren Mitchell remains officially open. The individual who held her captive in Sequoia National Forest for 5 years has never been identified or apprehended. Trail cameras continue to operate in remote sections of the park, and park rangers maintain heightened awareness for signs of someone living in extreme isolation. Occasional sightings are reported, figures glimpsed between trees, tracks found in remote areas, but nothing conclusive. Lauren continues her work in botanical conservation and her volunteer efforts with survivor support organizations. She has become an advocate for improved wilderness safety protocols and for better support systems for families of missing persons. She speaks occasionally at conferences and universities, sharing her experience not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to resilience and the possibility of recovery, even after unimaginable trauma. Her relationship with the forest has evolved. She hikes regularly now, though never alone and never in Sequoia. She has returned to field research in limited capacity, focusing on projects that allow her to engage with nature without triggering the memories that once made it unbearable. She describes herself as someone who has learned to carry her past without being defined by it, who has found a way to exist in both the present and the aftermath of trauma. Detective Amy Torres continues to review the case file regularly, following up on any new tips or sightings. She has said publicly that she believes the person responsible is still alive and still in the wilderness, and that someday, whether through their own mistake or through advances in investigative technology, they will be found. But she has also acknowledged that some cases resist resolution, that some questions remain unanswered despite the best efforts of law enforcement. Patricia remains Lauren's closest support, and the two sisters have developed a bond strengthened by the shared experience of loss and recovery. Their father, now in his 70s, visits as often as he can, grateful every day to have his daughter back, even though she returned changed in ways he could never have anticipated. Dr. Okoye, who guided Lauren through the most difficult stages of her recovery, has described the case as one of the most challenging and meaningful of her career. She has published several papers on trauma recovery and dissociative states, using Lauren's case with permission and anonymity as an example of the extraordinary resilience of the human mind. The forest itself remains unchanged. Sequoia National Park continues to draw millions of visitors each year, people who come to marvel at the ancient trees and experience the profound beauty of one of America's most treasured landscapes. Most of them walk the trails, take their photographs, and leave without incident. But somewhere in the remote sections, in the places where trails end and true wilderness begins, there may still be someone living in complete isolation, carrying their own story that no one else will ever fully understand. Lauren knows this. She has accepted it. And she has chosen to move forward anyway, to build a life defined not by what was taken from her, but by what she has reclaimed. In her own words, spoken during a recent interview, "The forest tried to keep me. Someone tried to keep me, but I found my way out, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. And every day that I wake up in my own bed, make my own choices, and live on my own terms, is a day that proves they did not win." That is the story of Dr. Lauren Mitchell, the botanist who disappeared into Sequoia National Forest in 2013 and was found 5 years later, barely alive, sitting against an ancient tree. It is a story of survival against impossible odds, of the darkest aspects of human isolation, and ultimately, of the resilience that allows someone to rebuild a life from the ruins of trauma. It is a story that remains unfinished, with questions that may never be answered. But it is also a story of hope, proof that even after the most profound loss, recovery is possible. Thanks for watching until the end. It really means a lot. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what stood out to you most. And of course, make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. See you soon.